So we're going to be talking about kind of the state of the union of Secure Boot, where it's been, where it's at, and where it's going. So I'm just going to jump into it. Let's see. So Secure Boot. This is the agenda. We have Secure Boot. We're going to talk about Secure Boot certificate rolling, the new UEFI CA signing requirements, what we're looking at for Secure Boot to be next, any of the tooling, testing, and the questions that anyone has. All right, so this is actually a Secure Boot brought to us by DALI 2. This is what I asked DALI 2 what it thought Secure Boot looked like, and this is what it said. All right, so what is it? So Secure Boot is just a technology that allows us to verify third-party firmware that is running in the OEM firmware environment. UEFI Secure Boot is just one of the many security boundaries in the boot environment, along with, like, for example, Measure Boot. Secure Boot just simply verifies the authenticity of the non-embedded drivers, applications. This means bootloaders, drivers, option ROMs must be signed ahead of time and have their signatures verified during startup if they want to run the UEFI environment. These non-embedded drivers and applications must be signed by an authority certificate that exists in the DB, such as the Microsoft third-party CA. So this slide really just deals with the history of Secure Boot and how it works. So the hierarchy of variables that establishes trust are the PK, the KEK, the DB, the DBX, and there also exists the DBT and the DBR. So the PK is, generally speaking, a certificate provided by an OEM. It could also be a certificate provided by an end consumer if they really want to replace it. The KEK can be many certificates. Generally speaking, what you're going to find here is the Microsoft first-party CA, and then also the third-party CA. And then also you'll usually find an OEM certificate alongside there, sometimes 2 or 3. Let's see. Again, with the DB, you might also find, you'll definitely find the Microsoft certificates, the first-party one and the third-party one, and then also the OEM certificates that go there. DBT and DBR are also part of the hierarchy, but we don't actually use them, as this next slide shows. So this is generally how you're going to find the Microsoft configuration of Secure Boot.
So as Michael said in his first talk, the certificates that Doug just described, which Microsoft has required PC OEM manufacturers to include and embed in their devices for over a decade, are due to expire in 2026. So as we've been preparing for that event, we have as we've been preparing for that event, we've been working out the logistics of how we're going to roll those keys and roll that out to our existing PC ecosystem. An incredibly difficult challenge and arguably one of the most complicated servicing updates that Microsoft has ever or will ever have to go through for Windows. This complexity comes from a few things. First, in all of the history of Secure Boot, Microsoft has never once done an update to the DB or the KEK. We've obviously deployed DBX updates to do revocations, but because we've never done it, there are a lot of unknowns. There could be firmware bugs that will complicate things as we roll out these new certificates that we just can't anticipate. As a result, and because of the diverse ecosystem that we are dealing with, Microsoft can't do it alone. So we are absolutely dependent on our OEM partners, our firmware vendor partners, to ensure the end-to-end actually comes together and works. So validation of all of the various configurations from a particular OEM is not something Microsoft can achieve on our own. We absolutely rely on our partners to do that. It's even more complicated when it comes to the update for the KEK. So the hierarchy that Doug described starts with the PK. On most of these systems, the PK is owned and managed by the OEM. So in order to update the KEK, which has to be signed by the PK, we have to do an outreach to every single OEM to get them to sign an update package that will now lay down the new updated Microsoft KEK. And then collect all those packages, and we will then be able to distribute them through Microsoft Update, targeting the right set of devices. An incredibly difficult challenge, a huge logistical challenge, working with all these partners to bring everything together. So where we are today, we've already issued the new certificate authorities for the beginning with 2023. Requirements for all new devices shipping next year will ensure that those devices come baked in with both the old set of certificates and the new certificates, so that we have a period of time where trust will exist for older versions of the operating systems, older option ROMs, older boot shims for Linux distros, and carry forward as we transition into the new certificate authorities. The real complexity comes with bringing forward all of our existing in-market systems and ensuring that they continue to boot. The CAs are, the keys are available already for OEM manufacturers to begin to take. While they don't become required until next year, if there's any OEMs in the room, represented in the room, or if you have contacts in OEMs, encouraging them to begin to bake those in now would be great. We'll have a transition period, as I said, where there will be a period of time where we require both the old and the new. Eventually, in some future date, we will begin only requiring the new ones. And then one of the big complicating factors that we've identified as part of this exercise that is inherent in the design of Secure Boot today is the concept of the default values. So when Secure Boot configuration is modified in the firmware, the DB values, the KEC values, all revert to the original shipping state, or whatever is defined as the DB default. That will pose a serious problem if and when we get to the point where we are now signing our boot code with a new certificate that wasn't originally part of that device's configuration. So again, a plea for OEMs and their partners who manage their firmware updates is to prepare updates to firmware so that those default values are also updated to reflect both the old and the new certificates. So if any configuration change happens to your Secure Boot configuration on a device, that device will continue to boot regardless of the operating system that it's booting from. So a bit more about the keys and that we're rolling, and then the impact of those. From our perspective, the most important ones are, of course, the values that get stored in DB. Those updates will be necessary to ensure that the things we start signing with our new certificate authorities will work, allowing Windows to boot in the case of the Windows PCA, that our Linux partners code continues to boot, their shims and their operating systems can boot with the third-party UEFI CA, as well as all of the option ROMs that are signed using that certificate authority. The KEC is critical for us in order to continue to service and maintain revocation lists. And so that's kind of the second order bit. And as we've gone through this exercise, we anticipated that we would encounter some OEMs who either no longer have access to their PK and thus can't sign the KEC, or whose PK has expired and so they can't sign it. And so as we encounter OEMs with those challenges, it's necessary again to have OEMs do a firmware update to be able to update their PK with a new one, and then they can then use that to sign the KEC update package, allowing us to continue to service revocations. And then this is going to be a common refrain. I think I have like 4 slides that call this one out. But again, OEMs updating their firmware so that the default values are updated to reflect both the old and the new is super critical.
Yeah, so really quickly I'm going to go through what is our tentative plan for the OS and keeping systems booting. So the OS is going to start appending the 2023 production CA to the DB. If this fails, Windows will indefinitely during this transition period continue to use the 2011 signed production boot manager, and then we're going to get telemetry back so we can figure out and work with those OEMs to figure out why it's failing. If it's successful, we're going to replace the 2011 boot manager with the 2023 signed boot manager. And then if Windows cannot detect the 2023 certificate in DB default, so this would be if you're not already publishing DB default, you need to start publishing it. Windows Update will then place a 2011 KEC signed secure boot recovery.EFI application immediately behind boot manager in the boot order, and it will be carrying a 2011 KEC signed 2023 production CA. This will be used to help Windows to boot, but you will almost certainly have a BitLocker recovery situation if this does go off. So with this, BitLocker is going to predictably reseal using that new certificate to ensure that the end user, if they do get this new certificate, does not BitLocker, have to go through BitLocker recovery. So there's also going to be a DB update for the third-party CA. We've already generated a 2023 production UEFI CA. We're also talking about generating other certificates. But right now, Windows Update will perform an append operation on the DB with a 2011 KEC signed 2023 third-party UEFI CA. Again, if it fails, we're going to log telemetry so we can work with that OEM to figure out why it's failing. And then we're going to predictably reseal. This is kind of an overview of that secure boot recovery application. It's very, very simple. All it does is appends a 2011 KEC signed 2023 production CA to the DB so that that 2023 boot manager can boot. It's going to append and then immediately do a reboot. So the code for that will be open source. You can look at it and understand how it works. It's already actually on U+, I believe, right now. So it is a thing that you can look at. Let's see. So for the KEC updates, again, Windows Update will perform an append operation on the KEC with an OEM PK signed KEC. This ensures Microsoft still maintains the ability to service DBX and DB. And again, we're going to predictably reseal. So if it is required, we will also be doing a PK update. So this is for systems this will be where Microsoft has already worked with the OEM, and they have lost access to a valid PK. So we're going to have multiple ways of remediating this, either through maybe a firmware update or through a PK signed PK update.
So we've been already engaged with OEM partners to begin testing these update packages. In the relatively short amount of time that we've been doing this, we have begun to hit real-world issues that for the most part, we anticipated these were the types of problems we might encounter. But just underscoring the severity of the impact of these types of things. So it's critical that through the partnership between us and our OEM partners and their firmware vendors that we ensure that that complete end-to-end really works seamlessly. So that when new operating systems ship whose boot components are assigned with the new certificate, that the devices are prepared for that, including things like updating installation media, updating the recovery media, so that those also are using the new signed or components that are signed with the new certificates, and they ship with the recovery tool that Doug just described, so that in the event that you actually do have a case where the firmware reverted to just trusting the old one, there is a path for those devices to kind of auto-recover. We have seen cases already where underscoring the challenges around the default values, where devices have been reset back and failed to boot as a result because they're trying to boot something that is signed with the new certificates. And then probably the most challenging part of this is, and the area where we have the least insight and control, is OEMs whose devices have firmware that have bugs or just have flaws in some of the logic, where they actually are breaking devices once the new certificates are provisioned or appended to the DB value. So we've seen cases already to date where some OEMs have had some sets of their devices that have had challenges, requiring firmware updates in order to make those devices capable of applying a DB append. We're also working with the Linux community very closely to prepare them for the eventual rolling of the third-party UEFI CA. So as far as timelines go, we expect that Windows will kind of be the first to shift over to signing with the new certificates. So sometime next year, we expect to begin signing Windows with the updated certificates. And then likely the following year is when we will start to transition the third-party UEFI CA over to the new certificate authority as well. I'm not going to read through this entire table. Suffice it to say, we had anticipated a lot of problems, and you'll see OEM, OEM, OEM on a lot of these rows, where the only path to recovery for systems in the wild who cannot take these updates will almost always require something for the OEM to do. And this is an area where we really desperately need OEMs to lean in and ensure that they're testing their devices really thoroughly, validating that they can take these. And an area that OEMs might want to consider additionally is just for devices that are still prevalent in the user population, but may have passed their servicing timelines, OEMs may want to consider preparing those devices as well for updates as an exception to their normal servicing rules. So a few things that we've walked away as key learnings from this exercise. Actually, these first two are not directly tied to this cert rolling, but things that we've observed about the way Secure Boot was designed and operated as well as implemented, that we as an ecosystem that maintain and control the UEFI, that we should address in the near or medium term. So the first is just the very breadth of trust that we ship every device with. So every Windows device, mandated by Microsoft, that our PC OEMs are shipping, broadly trust everything that has ever been signed by the third-party UEFI CA for the last 10 years, everything that we have signed with the Windows PCA for the last 10 years, whether or not you need them. So eventually migrating to a world where we can define trust more granularly and yet still have a very expressive way of establishing trust more flexibly than what we have with the limited control we can express through the DB today will allow us to tailor policies towards devices so they start with a smaller circle of trust and thus are not exposed to vulnerabilities that may have been signed by the same certificate authorities. And that is kind of a critical part of bringing security a little bit, or bringing the security of the PC ecosystem a little tighter, just in general. But it's compounded by the limitations in our revocation story. So revocations are extremely limited as well, and we're, as I think it was Michael who had mentioned, we're rapidly running out of space in storage for revocations. And so we need to address both sides of the trust problem as a community, so that we don't run into a case where eventually we can no longer revoke trust in things that are found to be vulnerable and are being used as attacks in the wild. A few other ones that I've already highlighted a bit. So the inability to update the Secure Boot defaults is something that was originally designed as a key security benefit of Secure Boot, but in practice kind of makes it very challenging when we actually do need to update the trust model. Reliance on the PK for signing the KEC updates, again, that poses an extraordinarily challenging problem for updating our KEC that just isn't practical when you look at the diversity of this ecosystem. So Microsoft doesn't have relationships with every OEM who builds devices that may ship with Windows and things signed with the third-party UEFI CA. Especially as you look at the Internet of Things, there's all kinds of devices where we don't even know these manufacturers exist, and that there are devices out there that need to have their Secure Boot updated, and we're blind to all of those problems. And then just in general, the finding or brainstorming ways, finding ways so that we can decouple some of the things like crypto, some of the security features of the firmware, so that we can update them outside of firmware updates in some secure way that allows us a little bit more agility and flexibility as kind of the operating system vendors. It's something that we believe is going to be an important evolution of our security fundamentals established through UEFI. So as we introduce the new signing certificates, the new certificate authorities, there are going to be new requirements that come along with those. The first one is something that we are requiring for anything that's going to be signed with the new certificate authorities in anticipation of future changes that will allow us to have more expressive trust and revocation policies. We're going to be requiring that all submissions to be UEFI signed include resource header information, identifying things like company name, product name, version, a handful of other attributes that are useful for expressing both trust and revocation policies. Obviously those won't be used from day zero, but we want to make sure that they're in place so that if and when we come along with something like SBAT, Secure Boot Advanced Targeting, that we have the properties available to us to be able to express really rich policy rules for revocations or for allowed rules. OpenSSL is another one that we're going to begin requiring that implementation, any code that ships with that has at least version 3.0 or above. And then Michael already mentioned the memory requirements that we introduced last year. And again, there's another session later to kind of drill into those a bit more.
So I'm really quickly going to talk about some of the things that we're investigating in order to work with Secure Boot next, right? So as we know, the world is moving to a post-quantum crypto world. So what that means is we need to really have hard requirements for the types of algorithms that are maybe required. And we're also investigating a method by which the OS is able to service this section of code within firmware. It is a thing that we're investigating right now because we don't know exactly which post-quantum crypto algorithms are going to win out, which ones are going to survive over the next decade. So we just want to be prepared to service them as we need to. This is one thing that we talked about, which is firmware-based SBAT. So similar how the Linux community has Secure Boot Advanced Targeting, we're investigating adding an additional UEFI signature type SBAT that may be used to revoke by policy-based expressions. So this is where all those new the new fields that the UEFI CA would be requiring, we would be using those in order to revoke a binary. One of the other ones that we've talked about is a keck sign keck update. So in order to avoid requiring talking to every OEM to get the keck signed by every conceivable PK, we've started looking at what would it take to get a keck sign keck to happen so that we can just update ourselves. And then obviously updatable Secure Boot defaults. We're currently exploring methods to update a Secure Boot default through a cryptographically secure channel. And this would remove the need for recovery applications in the future, and any future certificate rolling event, such as in the next 15 years. So I'm going to really quickly talk about at least one tool that I'm working on getting out. I was hoping to have it out by today, but it's being held up in legal, so hopefully it'll be out soon. So today in Surface, we actually have a repo where we store all of the keck, DB, and DBX contents, and then it's easily updatable, and we can easily figure out what DBX was included in which build of firmware. We're working on getting this published so that our OEM partners can use it as well. So this is just an UEFI signature list of what Microsoft suggests to be in your Secure Boot defaults. We also, as the last bulletin on here, this is new, we now have a shared UEFI PK. So if you want to get out of managing your own PK, we will have a public PK that you can include in your firmware that will be managed by Microsoft and that you can use in your, for example, test firmware that you provide to OEMs. This is useful because, for example, for Surface, we're getting out of having a PK per form factor, and we're moving towards a model where we have one PK, and then it's just serviced by the OS. So for testing, we're going to have a Hello UEFI test application. This test will just do an append operation on your firmware to make sure that it will boot the new 2023 certificates. We do have a recovery flow test, which will obviously do the append operation, but it's also going to do other things as well that we might need during the recovery flow if a device is secure boot defaults are either reset or something along those lines. And we also have a authenticated variable test, which will do things like check to see what's the biggest certificate that your firmware will allow, if your firmware allows for any other digest algorithms, such as stuff like that. So I believe that's it. Thank you. Can we take questions now, or do you want to do it later?
We're almost to the
Okay.
share time anyway, so.
All right, thank you very much.